My name's Thor, and you're listening to Cage Radio. Growing up with a brother is a weird thing. There were times in my life that I wished that my brother had never existed. Times when he and I would beat the paint out of each other, steal each other's stuff, and generally sabotage each other in ways that were either blissfully ignorant or intentional and willful. When my brother and I got our hands on the WWF games for the Sega Genesis, we discovered just how petty and whiny we could be. We played these games back when, if you wanted violence on TV, you had to choose between boxing and professional wrestling. My brother and I, like most kids back in the 90s, were pretty ignorant of the overwhelming truth behind wrestling's legitimacy, the efficacy of Hollywood Kung Fu, and actual combat sports like collegiate wrestling, jiu-jitsu, kickboxing, and any other fighting art that could actually win you a fight. To us, Hulk Hogan could easily defeat the likes of Mike Tyson. After all, Thunderlips was pretty dominant over Rocky Balboa till the gloves came off. Why would Mike Tyson fare any different? These days, I understand that Mike Tyson would likely beat the room filled with Hulk Hogan clones and eat their children. But try telling that to 5-year-old me. 5-year-old me thought that he could beat Mike Tyson through sheer anger alone, as if my fury would turn me into some sort of super soldier, capable of destroying elite athletes at a whim. Unfortunately, these super soldier powers were useless in WWF Royal Rumble for the Sega Genesis. My brother would push me up against the ropes and hit me dozens, even hundreds of times. For those who don't know, aka the 0% of women who watch these videos, these wrestling games were not like normal fighting games, where every time you landed a hit, your health bar would lower until you lost. No, not these games. Instead, your opponent would abuse you indefinitely until they decided to pin you or throw you out of the ring. To make matters worse, my brother and I weren't 100% sure on how to actually perform a pin or a ring out. This meant that every single match, someone was going to get thrown against the ropes and beaten into hamburger by the other one. Naturally, my brother and I were super good sports about the whole thing. We would pat each other on the back and say, "Good show, old chap. Care for a biscuit and some tea?" And then our British butler would come out and serve us, having just prepared our space unicorns to visit the good guy version of the Death Star. Well, the rest of that bit is super bad. Let's just move on. We didn't have a butler. And surprisingly, we weren't British. So stupid. I can't believe I wrote that. Look, believe me, the rest of it was even stupider. Alright, let's move on. Let's just read about the whole thing. There's a whole bit about how he was a Sith Lord, now is a Robocop, and forgive me, sometimes I get bored when I'm writing. Anyway, usually one of us would get really, really upset. No tea, no biscuits, no butler, just one of us getting really, really mad. My brother and I would start to fight. The fighting would turn to hitting, and then our parents would be forced to intervene. This progression of events, the fighting turning to hitting, was not uncommon. but the gravity and seriousness inspired by the wrestling games seemed to reach Lord of the Flies levels of animosity. In those moments, I would have burned the island down to find and kill my brother. To this day, it is the only game that our parents banned from the house, including Grand Theft Auto, where you murder hookers, sell drugs, steal cars, and go on mass shooting sprees. We all have our triggers, I suppose. These days, my brother and I are pushing 40 years old. I no longer see him as anything but one of my closest friends. Where my mother and father both fell into drug addiction and tragedy, my brother and I survived, stayed clean, kept some wisdom about us, and ultimately began living our best lives possible. My brother and I were blessed with very different talents and abilities. My brother has, even as a kid, always been very good at building things. Someone who was talented at working with his hands and took pride in things that he was able to accomplish simply by grabbing some supplies, some tools, and getting to work. I think he had more of a jack-of-all-trades approach to handiwork, whereas my brother benefited more from trade school environments where he could learn one skill more proficiently. My dad, I believe, struggled at these sorts of things. His attention span was very low and would often leave jobs half-finished, or at the very least, highly unpolished. I could always tell what my father had built. It always looked like it had been built as quickly as possible, like he had to take a pee really, really bad the whole time. My brother, on the other hand, either could fix something the right way, finishing it properly, or he couldn't do it at all. One thing my brother had and my father was a resistance to addiction. Where my father would crumple before the dark god of narcotics, my brother would deliver a 1-2 combination of that shit destroyed my parents and nah bro, I'm good. It was an attitude that maintained his humanity. I have never had the real ability to fix anything. In my house, when something breaks, either the maintenance guy fixes it or it stays broken. Often, my simple attempts to fix anything will 50% of the time result in the item being more and not less broken. Which is fine, I guess. I was blessed with the ability to entertain people. Even at an early age, it became clear that I could do public speaking, act, perform stand-up comedy, sing, dance, and above all else, write. You know, things that are pretty useless in the real world. I've often begrudged the universe for imparting me with no ability to do anything practical or handy. However, there was one commercially viable ability that I had that would lend itself to a long career in the security field, and I was pretty good at it. I knew how to fight. My brother and I grew up in Banta, a small farming community outside Tracy, California, just a couple of minutes down the freeway from Stockton, California. These days, Stockton is synonymous with the legendary brothers Nick and Nate Diaz. Stockton is a weird place. In the Central Valley of California, Stockton has a reputation that is similar to that of Tortuga, that smelly pirate town from Pirates of the Caribbean. Heat, gangs, violence, and corruption are the stories that kids living at the perimeter of the city would hear and say to each other. This foreboding place is where the Diaz brothers would be raised. Watching the Diaz brothers grow up, nearly mirroring my brother and I in age and location, it was hard to tell if the Diaz brothers were just hardened at birth or if the environment was what spit them out like human badgers. To this day, I don't really know the answer. I have learned a few things about perception. It's limited to moments in time, spaces of a few feet by a few feet, and more than anything, it's entirely dependent on the people you encounter and how you treat them that day. Sometimes you get up on the wrong side of the bed, and sometimes they do. The Diaz brothers seem like every morning they look at the wrong side of the bed, as though it were the hardcore mode on the game screen. One that really skilled players pick, because anything less is for casuals and noobs. The Diaz brothers are no casuals. The Diaz brothers are no noobs. So, the wrong side of the bed it is. But again, what do I know? Other than that both the Diaz brothers have openly tanked their own careers so hard that it actually had the opposite effect, catapulting them into must-see TV levels of stardom, surpassing nearly every star in the roster of fighters that Dana White has at his command. Harken back. How many times have Nick and Nate smoked weed against USADA's wishes, skipped press appearances, said something openly disrespectful to Dana to his face, threatened physical violence against someone with hundreds of media members present, or literally engaged with violence with dozens of witnesses around? It's nothing new. Many of these things have been done before. But with the Diaz brothers, the air was always somehow more legitimate, more convincing, like it wasn't being done for ratings or to further their careers, like Conor McGregor would do with his big business attitude. The Diaz brothers always seemed like they could care less about money, about pride, about winning, about Dana White, about the UFC, about appearing decent, about anything, except staying true to themselves, to their friends, and to each other. How hardcore. The Diaz brothers do what they want, when they want, for no other reason than it pleases them. To the average UFC fan, this attitude is like candy. Where Conor McGregor maintains a level of reverence among the casual audience, the Diaz brothers seem to illuminate and inspire the more hardcore crowd, those who have been around longer for the sport and have seen every ladder-climbing fighter attempt the same BS that everyone else has ever tried, usually to fall back down in ruin at the hands of better fighters, poor marketability, or a dislike from Dana and his dark council of acolytes. Skill-wise, Nick and Nate Diaz favor many of the same skills and abilities. Both prefer to fight off of their backs in a grappling exchange and apply a withering style of boxing that breaks people with high volume and inconspicuous power. Oftentimes, they will throw their long, lanky legs over people's backs and sink in chokes that other fighters simply lack the length and leverage to mimic. Not to mention the taunting strike, the Stockton slap. I took a half an hour to research every Stockton slap that I could find. In that short time on YouTube, I mainly just found that there is no consensus on the technique. Like, none. It's thrown from so many different angles and positions that the only thing that seems to matter is that you throw it, and you are from Stockton. I think that makes it even funnier. Maybe it's genetic. But the brothers' fighting styles are nearly identical, right down to the slap. Though if I had to be honest, it seems like Nick Diaz fights with a lot more anger, and overall throws less slaps and a lot more punches. Whereas Nate, especially in his later career, will slap so many people so many times that it will throw his fights for him. Maybe this isn't true. I mean, it was only 30 minutes of research. But it seems to me that between the two of them, Nick is definitely the more angry, and Nate is the more funny. Again, maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I've observed. There are other brothers, though, in the mixed martial arts space that are just as dangerous, and perhaps even darker, more mysterious, and more sinister. Enter Pride Fighting. During the height of Pride Fighting Championship in Japan, some of the most insane fights of all time took place between some of the least regulated fighters ever to walk the face of the planet. It was a time of steroids. It was a time of headstomps, soccer kicks, freak show fights, and backroom deals that the Yakuza forced into ink at gunpoint. Ironically, despite being based in the East, Pride was essentially the Wild West of the MMA scene during a time when the actual West was trying to find a foothold of legitimacy for the sport. And like any good Western, there was a sheriff in town. His name was Fedor Emelianenko. Fedor was known for having an extremely high fight IQ, excellent judo skills, fiercely explosive striking with devastating knockout power, and a strong constitution for punishment both given and received. Fedor had a legendary run in the organization that led many to believing him to be the one true GOAT, an argument that stands to this day even in the face of the likes of John Jones, Demetrius Johnson, and George St. Pierre. Fedor cast a spell of fascination over the masses of the sport. His calm demeanor before the storm of violence was his walking signature, and it inspired terror in the hearts of his opponents. Fedor would walk into the ring like a man heading to work at a salt mine. A cold, emotionless stare, usually angled at the floor of the arena. It always seemed to me like he was in a trance. Fedor, his opponents pre-fight, if you didn't know better, you'd think that he might be washed in shame, or maybe even facing his own death. But just the opposite. Fedor was getting ready to get as close as possible to killing a man as he possibly could. But even when he was in the midst of some of the most brutal assaults in the history of the sport, it seldom felt like an ounce of emotion ever made it across his face. Fedor was a mystery, a monolith, an institution, an eldritch creature beyond comprehension, especially for Westerners. So bright was Fedor's star that his brother, Alexander Emelianenko, was nearly forgotten, despite never being outside of the top 10 rankings. I examined the two quite a bit during the creation of this video. Physically, Alexander was the more gifted of the two, coming in at 6'3" or 6'5", depending on who you ask, and retaining the menacing presence of Jason Voorhees, complete with the lifeless stare. Alexander is a terrifying man. His fighting style was a high-pressure outside litany of straight rights, lefts, and brutal knees that, for the most part, would break his opponents down into bite-sized chunks. Despite his size advantage over his brother, Fedor was clearly the more explosive and methodical of the two fighters. I watched the Crow Cop fight for both brothers, where Alexander would recklessly charge forward against the Croatian, ultimately leaving himself open for the highlight head kick. Fedor would keep his composure, shutting down much of the kick's power with a multi-layer block coupled with the counter low kick. When you look at these differences in approach to the same puzzle, it becomes clear why one was the GOAT and the other was the GOAT's brother. Side note, I did a bit of extra research and came to realize that Alexander had a severe drinking problem and might have been drunk or recovering from a hangover during his fight with Crow Cop. Be advised, it might not have been the best of Alexander, but then it was Crow Cop. Whatever their fighting styles were, my interest is seldom the fighter's techniques. I am always more keen on the story behind the fight. Fedor is seen as a respectful, quiet, stoic man. He works hard and allows his fighting to speak for him. He lives in his hometown, stays close to his family, and lives life as a simple man. Alexander is, in many ways, much like his brother. Quiet, stoic, letting his fighting speak for him. But If Fedor were Dr. Jekyll, Alexander would be Mr. Hyde. Alexander has been arrested several times for various reasons, though the most notable and despicable was the sexual assault, drugging, and theft of passport he imparted on his housekeeper. This set of crimes brought him 4.5 years in prison, of which he only served 1.5. We will talk about that later. One thing that never ceases to amaze me is how the research I do for these articles will change my outlook of the fighters while I'm writing. As I wrote this, some things weren't adding up, so I dug deeper into the Emelianenko legacy. Frustratingly, much of the content surrounding them is in Russian, especially for Alex, who is not nearly as revered or famous. So it's hard to get a foothold on information. Some of what I dug up suggested, though, that Alex only speaks in lies and never works honestly as a member of the Thieves-in-Law, a prison gang from the Joseph Stalin days of the so-called bitch wars and gulags. The tattoos on Alex are very specific prison tats with specific meanings. Despite this, Alexander has denied their significance at every turn, which is allegedly a typical behavior of the Thieves-in-Law. Other things have suggested that he has a humble life with a family and a daughter and a wife and lives a loving and wholesome existence. Sifting through it, especially without being able to understand Russian and not knowing where the truth ends and lies begin, is a lot, and ultimately I had to settle on just not knowing. Some things, however, are known. Ramzan Kadyrov is the Chechen warlord appointed and supported by Vladimir Putin to keep Chechnya in line. Right? A task he has undertaken with human rights violations, assassinations, political bullying, military incursions, and overall being a big meanie head. Kadyrov is also famously in love with mixed martial arts. So much so that he entered his prepubescent sons into an underage MMA show. Fedor, upon hearing this, remarked that it was tasteless and that kids under the age of 18 are not even allowed to watch fighting. Kadyrov, being a super reasonable guy, decided to have a calm discussion about the differences of opinions with the MMA GOAT. And by calm discussion, I mean he may or may not have, probably, had one of his goons brutally attack Fedor's daughter, leaving her hospital-bound with severe stomach contusions. Around this time, Alexander Emelianenko was suspiciously released from prison and signed to Ramzan's Chechen fight promotion. Not the most brotherly thing in the world, signing with the guy who had your niece brutalized, but, Fedor took it all in stride, stating, "For me, Alexander is dead. He is disappearing. But I pray that he will come back to life and be found. Let him first apologize to those he raped, insulted, offended, and cheated on money. Help, Alexander? Do you know how old he is? Do you know for how long I have been helping him? For how long time? Now the best help is not to help him." I might need to check the definition of in stride. If you don't have a blood brother, or weren't raised with them, it might be difficult to understand the significance of the bond you should share with that brother. My brother and I have a good relationship, despite our childhood rivalry. We are now each other's closest allies. Nick and Nate Diaz are clearly ride or die types. Their relationship is so strong, you could probably see it from space. The Emelianenko's relationship, on the other hand, has been eroded by years of crass, reckless, and despicable behavior on the part of Alexander, and has left Fedor in a position to cast out the one who he should have been closest with. It is a shame. I don't know what I would do without my brother. We share so many memories, understand each other's pain like no one else does. But in spite of such sentiments, my brother is still a rabbit-punching punk who will hold you for hours against the turnstile and punch you until you throw the controller. Actually, you know what? I changed my mind, you aggravating son of a bitch. This has been an extra special Cage Radio production. I just want to thank you guys for listening. I didn't write this out, but I recognize the channel's starting to pick up some steam, and to those of you out there who are listening, I appreciate it. You guys are helping me change my life, the life of my family, the life of my daughter, helping me fulfill a dream, and giving me meaning behind being a security guard. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope it wasn't too goofy for you this time around. Have a great night. I'm Thor, and this has been Cage Radio.